At my daughter's wedding, her fiancé pulled out a chair as I was about to sit, and I crashed hard onto the polished marble floor. He smirked and said for everyone to hear, "Whoops, guess your place is on the floor after all." The guests stared, and my daughter cried out, her face a mask of horror. But as his own father rushed forward, he didn't look at his son. He looked at me, his eyes wide with disbelief, and his voice cut through the silence. "My God, Captain Donovan, is that you?" In that instant, the entire world shifted on its axis. Before we get into how it all happened, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what you would have done in this situation. Your support means the world. Main content. The screech of a car pulling into my driveway was the only thing that could break my focus. It was a crisp October afternoon in Berwyn, just outside Chicago, and the air smelled of burning leaves and the faint, sweet scent of metal polish. My garage, my sanctuary, was filled with the ghosts of 1,000 solved problems, a leaky faucet, a sputtering lawnmower, my late wife Sarah's old Schwinn bicycle hanging from the rafters like a memory. For the last 3 months, my attention had been on a new project, a vintage 1960 fire pedal car. I was meticulously restoring it, sanding down the rust, imagining the day I'd give it to a grandchild I didn't yet have. It was a connection to the life I'd lived for 35 years, a life of sirens, service, and brotherhood in the Chicago Fire Department. My hands, scarred and calloused from a lifetime of pulling hoses and forcing doors, moved gently over the faded red paint. The garage door flew open, and my daughter Chloe burst in, a whirlwind of joy and expensive perfume that instantly overpowered the smell of motor oil. "Dad, you are not going to believe this." She was practically vibrating, her eyes shining brighter than the autumn sun slanting through the dusty window. She had that same look she got when she was 7 and had just learned to ride that Schwinn without training wheels, pure, unbottled excitement. I put down my polishing rag, a smile spreading across my face before I even knew the reason. "What's got you so worked up, sweetheart? Did you finally land that high-rise contract?" "Better, so much better." She thrust her phone into my hand, her fingers trembling slightly. "Caleb proposed. Look, Dad, just look." My heart did a little jump. I took the phone, my rough fingers feeling clumsy against the sleek, cold glass. The video started playing. It looked like something out of a movie. A drone shot swooped over a glittering downtown Chicago, zeroing in on a rooftop restaurant I'd only ever seen in magazines. There was Chloe, looking beautiful, and beside her, Caleb Sterling knelt on one knee. He was handsome, I had to give him that, with a perfectly tailored suit and a watch that probably cost more than my truck. He opened a small box, and the diamond inside caught the light, exploding into 1,000 tiny rainbows. Chloe's gasp was audible, followed by a tearful, "Yes! Oh, we're getting married in the spring," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Isn't it perfect? He's everything, Dad. He's just everything." I watched the video again, forcing myself to focus. I saw the crystal champagne flutes, the skyline, the sheer expense of it all. But my eyes, trained over decades to spot the detail that's out of place in a burning building, caught something else. As a waiter moved to refill their water glasses, Caleb made a small, almost imperceptible gesture with his hand a flick of the wrist. It wasn't a wave of thanks. It was a wave of dismissal and irritation. It was the gesture of a man who saw the waiter not as a person, but as an inconvenient piece of moving furniture. A cold knot formed in my stomach, a familiar feeling I hadn't had since my last 5-alarm fire. It was the feeling of seeing a perfect-looking structure and knowing deep in your bones that something inside was dangerously wrong. "Of course, I'm happy for you, Princess," I said, handing the phone back and pulling her into a hug. My voice sounded genuine enough, I hoped. But as I held my daughter, the happiest I'd ever seen her, all I could feel was the chill from that tiny, dismissive flick of the wrist. Chloe left a few hours later, still floating on a cloud of bliss that I wouldn't have shattered for anything in the world. But after the door clicked shut, the silence of my house felt different. It was heavier. The joy she'd brought in with her had evaporated, leaving behind a cold residue of doubt. I tried to dismiss it. I told myself I was being an overprotective father, seeing threats in shadows where there were none. But 35 years in the CFD teaches you to trust your gut. Your gut is what tells you a floor is about to give way when it looks perfectly stable. It's what tells you the smoke has changed color, that the air has become superheated, that it's time to get your men out, now. My gut was screaming at me, and it had the same urgency as a 3-alarm bell ringing in the dead of night. I cleaned up the kitchen, put away the few dishes from my simple dinner, and walked through the quiet rooms of the home where I'd raised Chloe with Sarah. Every photo on the wall, every worn spot on the armchair was a testament to a life built together, a life of shared struggles and simple joys, a life that a man like Caleb Sterling, with his rooftop proposals and dismissive gestures, couldn't possibly comprehend. I found myself in my small office, a room cluttered with old firefighting manuals, union plaques, and a desktop computer that took a full 3 minutes to wake up from its slumber. The slow, rhythmic whirring of the hard drive was a sound from another era. I'm not a social media guy. I have an account mostly to see photos of my nieces and nephews and to keep in touch with some of the guys from the old firehouse. But finding Caleb Sterling wasn't hard. His profile was public, polished, and meticulously curated to scream success. The profile picture showed him leaning against a silver Porsche, wearing sunglasses that reflected the sunset over Lake Michigan, his smile a sharp, confident slash. It wasn't a smile, it was a logo. I started to scroll, and with each flick of the mouse wheel, the knot in my stomach tightened. It wasn't just the wealth that bothered me, it was the attitude that oozed from every post. There were photos of extravagant dinners with captions like, "Another Tuesday, another tasting menu, number grind." There were pictures from a ski trip in Aspen captioned, "Escaping the cubicle drones for some real altitude." He seemed to have a special kind of contempt for the very idea of a normal, working life. One post from a few weeks ago stopped me cold. It was a picture of some sleek, minimalist office space. The caption read, "Disrupting another legacy industry full of dinosaurs who can't adapt. If you're not evolving, you're dying. It's that simple. Dinosaurs." Is that what he saw when he looked at me? A relic from a bygone era, too slow and stupid to get out of the way of progress. I thought of my hands, of the men whose lives I'd held in them, of the fires we'd fought and the city we'd served. We weren't dinosaurs, we were the foundation. I kept digging, a grim feeling settling over me. I was no longer just curious. I was on a fact-finding mission, a size up of a dangerous situation. I scrolled through his friends' posts, through the comments, looking for the unguarded moment, the slip of the tongue that would reveal the real man behind the brand. I found it in the comments section of a friend's engagement announcement. The friend had written a heartfelt paragraph about marrying his high school sweetheart and blending their families. Deep in the replies, someone had tagged Caleb, asking when he was going to settle down. His reply, typed out for the world to see, was the key. It was the crack in the wall that showed the fire raging behind it. "Soon, man," he had written. "Finally found a girl with a good heart and no complicated family baggage. Total upgrade. No complicated family baggage." The words jumped off the screen and hit me like a blast of heat from a backdraft. Baggage. He was talking about Chloe, and I was the baggage. My history, my 35 years of service, the memory of her mother that filled every corner of our home, our working-class neighborhood, our entire life to him, it was all just inconvenient luggage, something to be checked at the door of his new, upgraded life. He didn't see a family built on love and sacrifice. He saw a liability. I leaned back in my creaky office chair, the glow of the monitor illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The house was completely silent now. The unease I'd felt in the garage had hardened into something cold and solid. Certainty. My little girl, my whole world, was in love with a man who saw her father as an obstacle to be managed, a piece of baggage to be discarded. And I knew, with the same certainty that told me which door to break down, that this was a fire I was going to have to fight. Sleep didn't come easy that night. The phrase "no complicated family baggage" echoed in the quiet darkness of my bedroom, each word a small, sharp stone pelting my peace of mind. When morning finally broke, the familiar sounds of my neighborhood, a garbage truck rumbling down the street, the distant bark of a dog seemed to belong to a world I was no longer fully a part of. A world where my daughter's happiness wasn't under a silent, insidious threat. I went through the motions, making coffee, reading the paper, but my mind was elsewhere. It was downtown, in a high-rise office, trying to understand the man who saw my life's work as a liability. My phone rang just after 10, and Chloe's cheerful voice was a stark contrast to the gray mood that had settled over me. "Dad, good morning. So, I have great news. Caleb was able to pull some strings and got us a reservation for tonight, at the Gilded Spire. Can you believe it?" I could, in fact, believe it. I'd heard of the Gilded Spire. It was one of those places on the Magnificent Mile where the appetizers cost more than my weekly grocery bill, a place with a dress code so strict it was practically a uniform for the wealthy. It was the perfect stage for whatever test Caleb had in mind for me. "Sounds fancy, sweetheart," I said, keeping my voice as even as I could. "Oh, it is. And Dad, Caleb is so excited for you two to really talk. His parents are still on their sabbatical in Asia, some kind of wellness retreat, so they won't be back until right before the wedding. But he said that's perfect, because it means tonight can be all about you two getting to know each other." A sabbatical. It sounded so casual, so dismissively luxurious, and convenient. It meant I'd be on my own, with no other family there to buffer the encounter. The chessboard was being set, and I had a feeling I was the pawn. 7:30, you said? I'll be there. After we hung up, I walked to my closet and pulled out the garment bag in the very back. Inside was my one good suit. It was a classic navy blue, well-made, bought 5 years ago for Chloe's graduation from the University of Illinois. I remember how proud I was that day, watching her walk across the stage, the fabric of this very suit feeling like armor. Now, it just felt like a costume. I laid it on the bed and inspected it like a piece of equipment before a 5-alarm fire. I found a small, faint stain near the cuff and worked at it carefully with a damp cloth until it disappeared. The suit was fine. It was a good suit. But I knew, with a sinking feeling, that next to Caleb's razor-sharp tailoring, it would look exactly like what it was, the very best a man like me could afford. An hour before I had to leave, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting my tie. The man looking back at me was 59 years old, with more salt than pepper in his hair, and a map of fine lines around his eyes from squinting through smoke and stress. But it was my hands that caught my attention. I held them up. They were clean, my nails trimmed, but there was no hiding what they were. The knuckles were thick, the skin tough, and a faint silvery scar ran across my right palm, a souvenir from a piece of falling glass at a warehouse fire in '07. These hands had pulled people from wreckage, held my wife's hand as she passed, and built my daughter's first tricycle. They were the hands of a life lived, a life of service. And I knew Caleb would look at them and see nothing but a common laborer. This dinner wasn't a celebration, it was an inspection, and I wasn't going there to seek his approval. I was going to do what any fire captain does when he arrives on a scene: assess the situation, identify the hazards, and figure out the best way to protect the people inside. As I grabbed my keys from the hook by the door, I felt the familiar weight of my late wife Sarah's wedding ring, which I kept on my keychain. I ran my thumb over the smooth, worn gold. "Help me keep our girl safe, Sarah." It was a silent prayer, a plea sent out into the quiet of the house. Then, I locked the door behind me and walked out into the cool evening air, a man heading into a 4-star restaurant with nothing but a suit and a prayer. The Gilded Spire wasn't just a restaurant, it was a statement. From the moment a doorman in a crisp uniform opened the heavy glass door, I felt like I had crossed into another country, one where I didn't speak the language. The lobby was a cavern of polished marble and dark, gleaming wood. A chandelier the size of a small car hung from the ceiling, dripping crystals that cast soft, shimmering light onto the impossibly wealthy patrons. The air was still and quiet, filled only with the hushed murmur of conversation and the gentle clinking of silver against porcelain. It was the kind of quiet that costs a lot of money. My sensible dress shoes felt like work boots clomping across the floor. A hostess with a serene smile and an earpiece glanced at my suit, her eyes doing a quick professional calculation before she led me toward the back. "The Sterling party," she murmured, guiding me to a corner booth. Chloe saw me first, and her face lit up with a genuine, beautiful smile that momentarily warmed the cavernous room. She stood to hug me, and I held on to her for a second longer than usual. Beside her, Caleb rose slowly, almost reluctantly. He was even more polished in person, his dark suit fitting him like a second skin. "Frank," he said, extending a hand, "good to finally meet you properly." His handshake was exactly what I expected, limp, brief, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was the handshake of a man who didn't want to risk touching the real world. "Caleb," I said, my voice sounding rougher than usual in the refined space. "Congratulations to you both." "Thank you," he said, that logo of a smile already in place. "We're very excited. Please, sit." The dinner began with a veneer of civility. Caleb ordered a bottle of wine with a French name I couldn't pronounce, swirling it in his glass and discussing its notes with the sommelier while I took a sip of water. Chloe, sensing the tension, tried to bridge the gap, talking animatedly about a new project she was designing, a subject we were both comfortable with. But Caleb kept steering the conversation back to his territory. "So Frank, Chloe tells me you were with the CFD," he began, leaning back in the plush leather booth. 35 years, is that right? That's incredible. It must be nice to be able to relax now, enjoy that city pension. He said the word pension like it was a foreign, slightly amusing concept, like a child's allowance. "It was a good career," I said simply. "I worked with a lot of great men." "Oh, I'm sure," Caleb said, taking a delicate sip of his wine. "It's a certain kind of person who runs into fires, isn't it? A real hero complex. My therapist says it's a fascinating psychological drive. The need for that constant adrenaline, that validation. You must miss the rush." I felt a muscle in my jaw tighten. He wasn't just dismissing my life's work, he was psychoanalyzing it, reducing decades of duty and brotherhood to a cheap psychological label. Chloe shifted uncomfortably. "Caleb, my dad saved a lot of people. He was a captain." "And that's admirable, sweetheart, truly," he said, patting her hand without taking his eyes off me. "I have the utmost respect for it. It's just a different world from the one I operate in. We don't save lives, we build futures. We create value where there was none. It's a different kind of contribution, I suppose." He then turned the conversation to his tech startup, peppering his speech with jargon like synergy, scalability, and monetizing disruption. He was speaking English, but it was a language designed to exclude, to make a man like me feel obsolete. He asked about my neighborhood, calling Berwyn charming and authentic. He said he and Chloe had driven through once. All those little brick bungalows, he mused. It's like a time capsule. It's so important for people to have those simple roots. Every word was a carefully polished stone, thrown with a smile. My anger was a low, steady flame inside me, but I kept it banked. I was still in assessment mode. I needed to see how far he would go. I found out when the waiter brought the check. He arrived with a small leather-bound folder and placed it discreetly at Caleb's elbow. Caleb picked it up, glanced inside, and his eyebrows shot up in a performance of mock surprise. He let out a low whistle. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he slid the folder across the white tablecloth until it stopped right in front of me. He leaned forward, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial tone that was loud enough for Chloe to hear clearly. "Well, Frank," he said, the smile never leaving his face, "I believe it's tradition for the bride's father to show he can contribute, right? To show he's behind the union." The silence was deafening. Chloe's face went pale. "Caleb, don't be ridiculous. I can get this." "Nonsense, darling," he said, waving her off. "This is between Frank and me, a man-to-man thing. He understands." His eyes were locked on mine, glittering with triumph. He had me pinned. If I refused, I was a cheapskate. If I accepted, I was his fool. I held his gaze for a long moment. Then, without a word, I reached into my jacket and pulled out my wallet. The leather was old and worn, softened by years of use. It looked pathetic sitting on the pristine tablecloth. I opened it and took out my credit card. My heart was pounding in my chest as I placed it on top of the bill, praying it wouldn't be declined. The number on the check was a blur, but I could make out the first digit, a 4. $412, more than a week's worth of groceries, gone in an evening of humiliation. The waiter took it away, and Caleb leaned back, looking completely satisfied. He had won. He had proven his point. He had taken my measure and found me wanting, and he had made me pay for the privilege. As I sat there, under the soft glow of the crystal chandelier, I had never felt so poor in my entire life. The walk out of the gilded spire was a blur. The opulent lobby, the hushed whispers, the doorman holding the door, it all felt like a scene from someone else's life. Caleb was infuriatingly cheerful, acting as though we'd just shared a wonderful bonding meal. He clapped me on the shoulder as we stood on the sidewalk, the cold night air a shock after the stuffy warmth of the restaurant. "Frank, it was a real pleasure," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "We absolutely have to do this again." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a threat, a promise of future humiliations. I had planned on taking the train home, wanting nothing more than the anonymous solitude of a late-night CTA car to process the evening. But Chloe was insistent. "No, Dad, please. I'm driving you home," she'd said, her voice tight with an emotion she was trying to suppress. The look in her eyes, a mixture of shame and desperation, made it impossible to refuse. So I said a stiff goodbye to Caleb and got into the passenger seat of Chloe's car, the silence between us as heavy and cold as a slab of marble. We pulled out onto Michigan Avenue, the glittering towers of the city scrolling past us like the credits to a sad movie. For 10 minutes, the only sounds were the hum of the engine and the soft clicks of the turn signal. The city lights bathed the interior of the car in shifting patterns of red and gold, but they couldn't penetrate the darkness that had settled between us. I stared out the window at the Chicago I knew, the city I had served, feeling like a stranger in my own home. Finally, as we merged onto the expressway heading west, leaving the dazzling skyline behind, Chloe's composure broke. "I am so sorry, Dad," she whispered, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. What he did with the check, that was completely out of line. I was mortified. "It's all right, sweetheart," I said, my voice flat. "No, it's not all right," she insisted, her voice gaining a desperate edge. He's from a different world. Money and power, it's like a game to them. He was probably just nervous, trying to show off or something. He doesn't mean to be cruel." I remained silent, letting her words hang in the air. I could hear how flimsy they sounded, how she was trying to convince herself as much as me. In his circle, she continued, rambling now, "It's all about posturing. They test each other, like this. It's how they show respect, in a weird way. By treating you like you're on their level, like you can handle it." She took a shaky breath. "He really does like you, Dad. He told me he thinks your career is fascinating." Every excuse she made felt like a small betrayal, not of me, but of herself, of the smart, grounded woman I had raised. She was defending the indefensible, trying to patch a hole in a sinking ship with paper towels. I could have argued. I could have listed every condescending remark, every veiled insult, every calculated move he had made all evening, but I knew it would do no good. It would only force her to defend him more fiercely, to choose a side. And my goal wasn't to win an argument, it was to save my daughter. We turned off the highway, and the familiar streetlights of Berwyn replaced the harsh glare of the city. We were back in my world, a world of tidy lawns and American flags, a world Caleb had dismissed as a time capsule. I let her finish, waiting until the silence returned, heavier this time. Then I turned to look at her. "I'm not the one you have to make excuses to, Chloe," I said, my voice softer than I expected. "And I'm not the one who's angry right now. I'm just sad." She glanced at me, her expression a mix of confusion and hurt. "Sad? Why?" I took a breath. "I just have one question, and I want you to really think about it. Forget about me. Forget about whether I was offended or not. This is about you. How did you feel tonight?" I paused, letting the question sink in. "When you were sitting in that beautiful restaurant, next to the man you love, watching him talk to your father, did you feel proud, Chloe?" I held her gaze. "Were you proud of him? Were you proud of where you come from?" Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Her eyes glistened under a passing streetlight. The question landed in the car like a stone, and the ripples spread out in the quiet space between us. She couldn't answer, because we both knew the truth. The rest of the drive was just a few blocks, but it felt like miles. When she pulled up in front of my house, the little brick bungalow that Caleb had called simple, she put the car in park, but kept her hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead. "Good night, Dad," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Good night, Princess," I replied. I got out of the car and watched her drive away, her red taillights disappearing down the quiet suburban street. She was alone now, with a question she couldn't answer and a choice she didn't want to make. The weeks that followed that dinner were quiet, but it was the loud, ringing quiet that comes after an explosion. My conversations with Chloe took on a new, careful quality. The easy-flowing chats we used to have were replaced by shorter calls, filled with polite questions and cautious answers. I could hear the conflict in her voice, a constant tug-of-war between her loyalty to me and her love for Caleb. She was asking questions, not just of me, but of herself. I knew my question in the car had been a small seed, but I also knew that seeds of doubt, once planted in fertile ground, can grow into mighty trees. I was giving her the space and the silence to let it grow, and it was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. I was in my armchair one Tuesday evening, the reading lamp casting a warm pool of light on an old history of the Great Chicago Fire, when the peace was shattered. It wasn't a knock on the door, it was a series of hard, impatient pounds, the kind that signals an emergency. For a second, my old instincts kicked in, my heart rate spiking as I prepared for the worst. I looked through the peephole, and my blood ran cold. On my front porch, illuminated by the soft yellow light, was Caleb Sterling. I opened the door, and he didn't wait for an invitation. He pushed past me, bringing a gust of cold November air and the faint, expensive scent of his cologne into my home. He was dressed in a dark, tailored coat, but his usual polished composure was gone. His face was tight with fury, his eyes burning with a venom I hadn't seen even at the restaurant. "We need to talk," he said, his voice a low growl. He strode into the middle of my living room, his sharp-angled shoes looking alien and predatory on the braided rug Sarah and I had bought 20 years ago. I closed the door slowly, deliberately. My years on the job had taught me one crucial thing about confrontations. Stay calm when the other guy is losing his head. "About what, Caleb?" "Don't play dumb with me," he snapped, spinning to face me. "Chloe. She's been different ever since that disaster of a dinner. Distant, asking questions, doubting everything. What did you say to her? What poison have you been dripping in her ear?" I stood by the door, my hands relaxed at my sides. "Chloe is a smart woman. She has her own mind." His laugh was a harsh, ugly sound that didn't belong in my quiet house. "Oh, I see. The wise, silent father act. It's very noble, but I know what you're doing. You're trying to sabotage this, because you can't stand that she's building a life you could never give her." He gestured wildly at my living room, at the comfortable but worn furniture, the photos on the mantelpiece, the whole history of our family. "You can't stand that she's choosing this." He pointed vaguely toward the window, toward the city, toward his world, over all of this. I didn't move. I just watched him. He was like a flashover, a sudden, violent eruption of heat and gas in a closed space. And just as dangerous. "This is her home," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "This is where she comes from. There's no shame in that." "Shame?" He took a step closer, trying to use his height to intimidate me. It was a tactic that might have worked in a boardroom, but in my living room, it was meaningless. "This isn't about shame. It's about ambition. It's about the future. And you are stuck in the past, her past." He saw the stillness in my face wasn't fear, and it enraged him further. The last of his control finally snapped. He stopped pacing and stood directly in front of me, his voice dropping to a low, menacing hiss. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, locking his eyes on mine. "You are going to pick up the phone, you're going to call her, and you are going to tell her you were wrong about me. You're going to tell her you overreacted, that you were emotional, and that you give us your unconditional blessing. You're going to endorse me." The audacity of it was breathtaking. I held his gaze and asked one simple question. "Or what?" A cruel, triumphant smile spread across his face. "Or you will find out what it's like to be cut out completely. I will make sure she chooses my future over your past. I will give her a life so full of everything you can't offer that she won't have time to look back. You'll see her at the wedding, and maybe on holidays, if you're lucky. You won't just be the father of the bride, you'll be a memory, old man." A piece of baggage she finally decided to leave behind. The threat hung in the air between us, ugly and sharp. He expected me to crumble, to plead, to negotiate. He mistook my silence for weakness. But in that moment, all I felt was a cold, hard clarity. This wasn't a scared kid making idle threats. This was a calculated declaration of war. I took one step forward, not with anger, but with a finality that made him flinch. "I think you should leave my house," I said. "Now." He stared at me for a heartbeat, his bravado faltering in the face of a resolve he couldn't comprehend. He had played his final card, and it hadn't worked. He turned without another word, pulled the front door open, and slammed it shut behind him, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. I stood there in the sudden silence, listening to the roar of his Porsche's engine as it tore away down my quiet street, leaving only the smell of burnt rubber and the chill of a battle that had just begun. After Caleb left, the house felt contaminated. His anger and entitlement seemed to linger in the air like a bad smell. I spent a long time just sitting in my armchair, the history book forgotten in my lap, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. He had drawn a line in the sand. On one side was his glittering, hollow future. On the other was my past, our family, everything Chloe and I had ever been to each other. And he was going to force her to choose. My first instinct, the firefighter in me, was to sound the alarm. I wanted to call Chloe, tell her everything, lay out the bald-faced threat from the man she was supposed to marry. But the father in me knew better. Charging in with accusations would only put her on the defensive, making her feel trapped between the two men in her life. It would make his threat a self-fulfilling prophecy. Caleb wanted a war between us, but I wasn't going to give it to him. I had to fight this fire with finesse, not with a fire hose. The next afternoon, I drove downtown. Her office was in the West Loop, in one of those old brick warehouses that had been converted into a trendy, open-concept workspace. I walked past rows of young architects hunched over massive computer screens, the air buzzing with creative energy and the quiet confidence of people building things. Her assistant pointed me to a glass-walled conference room where Chloe was studying a large architectural model of a skyscraper. This was her world, a world she had built for herself through talent and sheer force of will. She looked up, surprised, as I tapped on the glass. A flicker of apprehension crossed her face before she replaced it with a smile. "Dad, what are you doing here?" I was in the neighborhood for an appointment. I lied smoothly, holding up a paper bag, and I remembered you loved the pot roast from that little diner on Jackson. Figured I'd bring you lunch. We sat at the conference table, the giant model of the skyscraper between us like a third guest. For a few minutes, we just talked. I asked about the project, and she lit up, explaining the challenges of the design, the way the glass would catch the morning sunday. Seeing her in her element, so smart and capable, filled me with a fierce, protective pride. As she ate, I guided the conversation gently. I began looking at the model. This is what your mother always admired most. The ability to build something beautiful and strong where there was nothing before. She believed that's what a life was supposed to be. Chloe's fork stilled. She looked at me, her eyes questioning. She would have been so proud of you, Chloe. Not just for this, I gestured around the impressive office, but for the woman you've become. You're kind, you're strong, and you have a good heart. That's a foundation that can withstand anything. I let that sink in before I continued. Your mom had a saying. She said you can always judge a person's character by how they build things. Do they build walls to keep people out, or do they build bridges to bring people in? When they get a little power, do they use it to make their own world bigger, or do they use it to make the room bigger for everyone else? I looked directly at her, my voice soft but firm. I know you're in a tough position. I know you love Caleb. And I want you to know, no matter what you decide, that I will always, always be in your corner. My love for you isn't conditional. It doesn't come with threats or ultimatums. She knew then that this wasn't just a casual lunch. She put her fork down. Dad, what's going on? Did something happen? I shook my head, not wanting to give Caleb the satisfaction of becoming the topic of our conversation. I just needed to look my daughter in the eye and remind her of the stock she comes from. I want you to be happy, sweetheart. That's all I've ever wanted. But happiness has to be built on a solid foundation. And that foundation is respect. I reached across the table, my calloused hand covering her smooth one. A good man, Chloe, I said, my voice thick with the importance of the words. A man worthy of you doesn't build himself up by tearing down the people you love. He doesn't see your family as a problem to be solved or baggage to be managed. He sees them as a part of you. He doesn't shrink your world, he expands it. He builds a bigger table so everyone has a seat. Tears welled in her eyes as she squeezed my hand. I had given her the blueprint. I had reminded her of the core principles we'd built our family on. I hadn't told her a single thing about Caleb's visit, but in that moment, I knew I had told her everything she needed to know. I stood up to leave. Enjoy your lunch, princess. The building looks beautiful. I walked out of her office, leaving her alone with her thoughts, her pot roast, and the towering model of a future she now had to reevaluate. The choice was hers, and hers alone. All a father could do was make sure she had the right tools for the job. The months leading up to the wedding passed in a strange, tense blur. Chloe never told me what she was thinking after our talk at her office. She was caught in an impossible current, and I could only watch from the shore, hoping she wouldn't be pulled under. She was pleasant and loving during our calls, but a new, fragile barrier stood between us. We talked about flowers, guest lists, and all the trivial details, never once mentioning the rot at the foundation of it all. I knew Caleb was on his best behavior around her, a charming, attentive fiancé, and I had become the unspoken complication, the baggage she was still figuring out how to handle. I held on to the hope that the tools I had given her were enough. Now, it was here. The day had arrived with the kind of impossible, cinematic beauty that only a Chicago spring can offer. The wedding was at a sprawling botanical garden in Glencoe, on the North Shore, a place of manicured lawns and eye-wateringly expensive tranquility. I stood in the doorway of the bridal suite, a room buzzing with the nervous energy of bridesmaids, the hiss of hairspray, and the scent of champagne. And in the center of it all, standing before a floor-to-ceiling mirror, was Chloe. She looked like a vision from a dream, her dress a cascade of elegant, simple white. All the noise in the room seemed to fade away as she turned and saw me. The bridesmaids fell silent, sensing the weight of the moment. I walked toward her, my heart a complicated knot of pride, love, and a deep aching fear. This was it, the moment every father both longs for and dreads. "Hi, Dad," she whispered, her eyes shining. "Princess," I said, my voice thick. You look just like your mother." It was the highest compliment I could give, and she knew it. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her perfectly made-up cheek. I reached out and gently wiped it away with my thumb, just as I had when she was a little girl with a scraped knee. For a brief second, the unspoken tension between us vanished, and we were just a father and a daughter, standing on the precipice of a huge change. "I have something for you," I said, reaching into the pocket of my rented tuxedo. "You're something old." I opened my palm to reveal a small, silver locket. It was delicate and antique, one I had bought for Sarah on our first anniversary. It wasn't flashy or expensive, but it was real. "I put a new picture inside," I told her. She took it with a trembling hand and clicked it open. Tucked inside was a tiny, smiling photograph of her mother on our wedding day. Chloe's breath hitched, and she clutched the locket to her chest, closing her eyes. "So you remember," I said quietly, my hand resting on her shoulder, "that you never walk alone. No matter where you go or who you're with, you remember the stock you come from. You remember her strength." It was the closest I could come to a warning, a final reminder of the values she was about to bind herself to. "Thank you, Dad," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I love you." She looked at me then, and in her eyes I saw more than just a bride's nerves. I saw a quiet resolve, a hidden depth that I hadn't seen before. It wasn't the look of a woman who had been defeated. It was the look of a woman who had a plan. The wedding coordinator poked her head into the room, her smile bright and professional. "It's time," she chirped. 5 minutes to showtime." Chloe took a deep, steadying breath and fastened the locket around her neck, tucking it just inside the neckline of her dress, a hidden source of strength against her skin. She looked at our reflection in the mirror, the aging fire captain in his rented suit, and his beautiful daughter, the brilliant architect. Then she turned to me. "Ready?" she asked. "I'm with you all the way," I answered. She slipped her arm through mine, her hand gripping my forearm with surprising strength. As we walked out of the suite and toward the sun-drenched garden where the ceremony awaited, I felt a strange sense of calm. The waiting was over. The battle was about to begin. The music from the string quartet swelled as we reached the head of the aisle. The garden was breathtaking, with rows of white chairs filled with guests all turned to watch us, their faces a sea of smiling strangers. It was a perfect scene, meticulously designed and flawlessly executed. But beneath the perfumed air and the soft romantic music, I could feel the hum of a dangerous high-voltage wire. My focus narrowed to the end of the aisle, to the man standing there waiting, Caleb. He was beaming, but it wasn't the nervous, love-struck smile of a groom. It was the confident, self-satisfied smirk of a man admiring his latest, most prized acquisition. As we walked, I felt Chloe's hand tighten on my arm. It wasn't a tremble of fear. It was a steady, grounding pressure. We were in this together. When we reached the officiant, Caleb stepped forward, taking Chloe's hand in his. I saw the way his thumb stroked the back of her hand, not with tenderness, but with a casual sense of ownership. The officiant smiled warmly. "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" Every head turned to me. I looked at my daughter, her eyes meeting mine with that same quiet resolve I'd seen in the bridal suite. I was supposed to say, "Her mother and I do," but instead I just said, "She gives herself, with her family's blessing." I gave her hand a final squeeze, a silent transfer of strength, and stepped back to take my seat in the front row. I wasn't giving her away. I was deploying my most trusted lieutenant on her most important mission. From my seat, I had a perfect view. I watched Caleb lean in and whisper something in Chloe's ear, a little secret just for them. She smiled politely, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. The ceremony was a blur of beautiful, empty words about love and partnership, but my attention was fixed on the groom. He was a performer, playing the part of the devoted husband flawlessly. Then came the vows. Chloe went first. Her voice was clear and steady as she read the vows she'd written. They were beautiful, speaking of partnership, respect, and building a shared future. But they were also carefully constructed, like one of her architectural designs, strong, elegant, and giving nothing away. Then it was Caleb's turn. He unfolded a piece of paper and began to speak, his voice resonating with practiced confidence. He spoke of how Chloe had changed his life, how she had opened his eyes to new things. But then the tone shifted. "I don't look at love as the end of a journey," he said, looking at Chloe but projecting to the crowd. "I look at it as the ultimate startup. We're taking the best of what we have and creating something entirely new. We're not just merging our lives, we're leveling up. We're leaving the past behind to build a new legacy, a sterling legacy, from the ground up, one that will be synonymous with success and forward thinking." The guests smiled and nodded, hearing only the ambitious, romantic words of a modern man. But I heard the subtext. I heard the clear, coded message, leaving the past behind, a new legacy. It was a public declaration of his intent to erase her world, to overwrite the Donovan name and everything it stood for. It was the verbal equivalent of bulldozing my quiet bungalow in Berwyn to build a glass skyscraper. It was a final, dismissive insult, delivered with a smile in front of God and everyone. I sat perfectly still, my back straight, my expression neutral. But under the crisp white tablecloth, my hands clenched into tight, bloodless fists. The last shred of doubt, the last hope that I had misjudged him, evaporated in the warm spring air. This man wasn't just arrogant. He was a colonizer, and my daughter's heart was the territory he intended to conquer. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the officiant declared. The crowd erupted in applause as Caleb dipped Chloe into a dramatic kiss for the cameras. As I watched them, I didn't feel sadness. I felt the cold, calm certainty of a captain who has just confirmed the fire is as bad as he feared. The ceremony was over. Now, the real fight would begin. The reception was held under a magnificent white tent on the far side of the gardens, a cathedral of canvas and fairy lights. Champagne flowed from fountains, and a jazz band played smoothly on a polished dance floor. To the hundreds of guests, it was the picture of perfect, sophisticated joy. They mingled and laughed, oblivious to the fact that they were not attendees at a celebration, but audience members at a public execution. I moved through the crowd, a ghost at the feast. I nodded politely to the few people I recognized, some of Chloe's friends from college, but mostly I was invisible, an old man in a rented suit, adrift in a sea of wealth and influence. I found the seating chart, an elegant board of calligraphed names, and ran my finger down the list. Donovan, Frank, table 18. I scanned the layout. Just as I expected, table 18 was tucked away in the back corner, as far from the sprawling head table as one could get without being in the parking lot. It was a table for the afterthoughts, the obligatory invitations, the baggage. I made my way there and found my seat. I was placed with Chloe's great-aunt Millie and a lovely older couple who had been our neighbors for 20 years, the Hendersons. They too had been exiled to the back of the room. We shared a moment of quiet, knowing camaraderie. We were the remnants of Chloe's other life, the one being systematically erased today. For a few minutes, there was a strange peace in our little corner of the tent. We watched Chloe and Caleb make their grand entrance to thunderous applause. We watched them take their seats at the head table on their raised dais, like a king and his new queen. The first course was served, and the low hum of conversation filled the tent. That's when I saw him approaching. Caleb was making the rounds, a glass of champagne in hand, playing the part of the gracious host. He moved from table to table, charming, laughing, his every move a performance. I watched his path, and I knew with a cold certainty that he was coming for me. This was his victory lap. He arrived at our table with a brilliant smile. "Aunt Millie, you look beautiful. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, so glad you could be here." His eyes finally landed on me. "Frank, I'm glad to see you're settling in. Not too overwhelmed by all this, I hope?" "It's a beautiful party, Caleb," I said, my voice level. "We do our best," he said with a dismissive wave. "Chloe deserves nothing less. We were just talking up at the head table about how fascinating it is to bring two different worlds together like this. Really, it's a social experiment." He gestured to my chair. "Please, don't let me keep you from your dinner." It happened in a split second, a piece of cruel choreography so smooth it was almost invisible. As I turned and began to lower myself into my chair, my hand resting on the table for balance, Caleb moved behind me. He leaned in as if to say something confidential, and with a deft, sharp tug, he pulled the chair straight back. There was nothing there. My body, committed to the motion of sitting, found only empty air. For a horrifying, weightless moment, I was suspended in space, and then I crashed. The impact with the hard, unforgiving floor was brutal. It knocked the wind straight out of my lungs, and a sharp, white-hot pain shot through my shoulder. The sound of my fall, a heavy, undignified thud, and the clatter of a fork I'd knocked off the table, cut through the ambient noise. Conversation at the tables nearest to us sputtered and died. A circle of stunned silence began to spread out from table 18. Aunt Millie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Mr." Henderson half rose from his seat, his face a mask of disbelief. And in that sudden, dead quiet, Caleb's voice rang out, clear and laced with mock concern. He looked down at me, sprawled on the floor, and he laughed. "Whoops," he announced, his smile reaching his eyes for the first time all day. It was a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. Looks like someone's a little unsteady on their feet. Age gets to us all, I guess. He paused, letting everyone absorb the sight of me, the father of the bride, lying helpless on the ground. Then he delivered the final, crushing blow. "Guess your place is on the floor after all." From across the tent, I heard it. It wasn't a word. It was a sound of pure agony, a sharp, piercing cry. "Dad!" It was Chloe. She had seen it all. She was on her feet at the head table, her face a portrait of utter horror, her beautiful wedding day shattered into a million pieces at her feet. Time seemed to freeze. I was on the floor, the sharp pain in my shoulder radiating through my body, but it was nothing compared to the cold, hollow ache of humiliation. The faces of the guests were a blur of shock and pity. Caleb's triumphant smirk seemed to hang in the air above me like a toxic cloud, and the sound of Chloe's scream was still echoing in my ears, a sound I knew would haunt me forever. "Mr." Henderson was leaning over me, his face etched with concern. "Frank, are you all right? Let me help you up." Just as he was extending a hand, a commotion started near the entrance of the tent. A distinguished-looking couple in their early 60s hurried in, their faces showing the slight fluster of being late. The woman was elegant, and the man beside her moved with a sharp, commanding presence. He had the unmistakable air of a man used to being the most important person in any room. He scanned the crowd, a look of annoyance on his face that quickly turned to confusion as he registered the dead, awkward silence and the strange tableau at the back of the room. It was Marcus Thorne, Caleb's father. He started moving toward the head table, but his path faltered as his gaze swept past our corner and snagged on the scene. He stopped dead. His eyes took in his son, Caleb, standing there with a cruel smile just beginning to fade. He saw the shocked faces at table 18. And then he saw me, on the floor, struggling to get my bearings. His face changed. The annoyance and confusion were wiped away, replaced by an expression of profound, earth-shattering disbelief. He moved forward, his pace quickening, his path no longer aimed at the head table but directly, unstoppably, at me. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. He completely ignored his son, walking past him as if he were a statue. He stopped only when he was standing over me, his sharp, lawyerly eyes wide with a recognition that defied all logic. The silence in the tent was now absolute. Every guest was holding their breath. Marcus Thorne stared down at me as Mr. Henderson finally helped me into the chair. His voice, when it came, cut through the stillness like a surgeon's scalpel. It wasn't a question of concern, it was a question of awe. "My God," he breathed, his voice cracking with an emotion I couldn't place. "Captain Frank Donovan, is that you?" The name, my full name and rank, echoed in the tent. A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. Caleb's jaw went slack, his face a cartoon of bewilderment. He looked between his father and me, his brain unable to connect the two. Marcus Thorne didn't wait for my reply. He seemed to realize the impossibility of the scene around him, the man he revered being treated like dirt at his own son's wedding. He turned, his back to me, and faced the hundreds of stunned guests. He was in his element now, a litigator addressing a captive jury. "Everyone," he began, his voice booming with an authority that commanded total, undivided attention. "I apologize for our late arrival, but it seems I've arrived at a crucial moment. I need you all to understand something." He took a breath, composing himself. "Most of you here know me as a lawyer, as a businessman, But many years ago, my life was very different. On a Tuesday morning in the fall of 2005, I was in a meeting on the 27th floor of the Meridian Tower downtown when the fire alarms went off. A collective gasp went through the guests who remembered the infamous high-rise fire. It had been headline news for a week. The smoke was thick, the fire was spreading below us, and the stairwells were impassable, Marcus continued, his voice tight with the memory. My partner and I were trapped. We made our way to a corner office, broke a window for air, and we waited, thinking we were going to die. And then, through the smoke, a team of firefighters appeared on the floor. Their captain, the man leading the charge, got everyone else out, but just as he was about to leave, a section of the ceiling collapsed, trapping my partner and me behind a wall of flame and debris. He paused, letting the weight of the story settle. He turned and pointed a trembling finger directly at me. "That man," he said, his voice thick with 20 years of unspoken gratitude, was Captain Frank Donovan. He was ordered to evacuate. The floor was unstable, but he refused to leave us behind. He came back through the fire. He shielded us with his own body as debris rained down, and he single-handedly cleared a path and dragged the two of us, one by one, to safety. He saved my life. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. The whispers started instantly, a wave of awe and disbelief. People were turning in their seats, staring at me, the man in the rumpled tuxedo, with entirely new eyes. The embarrassing old father-in-law had just been transformed into a bona fide hero. Marcus Thorne's gaze finally fell upon his son. The disappointment in his eyes was a terrible thing to witness. "This man is the reason I am standing here today," he declared, his voice rising with passion. "He is the reason my wife has a husband. He is the reason our family exists. He is the reason you," he locked eyes with Caleb, "have a father." Caleb's face had drained of all color. He looked as though he had been turned to stone. The foundation of his world, his arrogance, his casual cruelty, had just been pulverized before a crowd of his peers. The simple man he had tormented, the baggage he had tried to discard, was the very hero his own father owed his life to. Across the room, Chloe was staring, her face a beautiful, tragic mask of horror, revelation, and a fierce, surging pride. The tears that had been streaming down her face in shame were now flowing for an entirely different reason. Marcus Thorne turned back to me, his expression softening. The formidable lawyer was gone, replaced by a man humbled by a memory. "It is an honor to see you again, Captain," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The war was over, the bomb had gone off, and all that was left was to survey the wreckage. The silence that followed Marcus Thorne's speech was more profound than any I had ever experienced. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air and sound out of the magnificent tent. All eyes were on the three of us, the hero, the man he saved, and the son who had committed an unspeakable dishonor. Caleb stood frozen between his father and me, the blood completely gone from his face, leaving a pale, waxy mask of horror. He looked from his father's face, etched with a disappointment so deep it was like a physical wound, to Chloe's, where tears of pride and sorrow now mingled. Finally, his eyes met mine. For the first time, I didn't see arrogance or contempt. I saw a man, a boy really, who was utterly and completely broken. The intricate scaffolding of his life, built on wealth, status, and condescension, had just been demolished by a single, inconvenient truth. Something inside him seemed to give way. His shoulders, which he always held with such rigid, confident posture, slumped forward. He took a shaky breath, then another. He turned, not toward me, not toward his father, but toward the small stage where the jazz band had been playing. They had fallen silent, their instruments held limply in their hands. He walked toward it, his steps unsteady, his expensive shoes suddenly looking too big for him. The whispering of the guests stopped as he reached the stage and took the microphone from its stand. The slight feedback screech from the speakers was the only sound in the world. He gripped the stand with both hands, as if he needed it to hold himself up. "My father," Caleb began, his voice hoarse and unfamiliar, a raw, trembling thing. "My father just told you a story about a hero, but he doesn't know the whole truth. He doesn't know the worst of it." He swallowed hard, his gaze sweeping across the faces of his friends, his colleagues, all the people he had spent a lifetime trying to impress. "For the last 6 months, I have been treating that hero, the man who saved my father's life, like he was dirt beneath my feet." A fresh wave of murmurs rippled through the tent, but Caleb spoke over them, his voice gaining a desperate confessional strength. "I mocked his home. I made fun of his career. On my own social media, I referred to him and his life as complicated family baggage that my new fiancé thankfully didn't have. He looked at Chloe, his eyes pleading. I was too stupid and arrogant to see that his baggage was my wife's entire foundation. Her strength, her character. He took another shuddering breath, forcing the words out. It gets worse. I invited him to a dinner at the most expensive restaurant I could think of. And I did it for one reason, to force him to pay a bill I knew would hurt him. I did it just to watch him squirm, just to prove to myself that I was more powerful. Gasps of genuine shock and disgust came from the nearby tables. He wasn't sparing himself. He was laying every single one of his sins bare. And tonight, he said, his voice dropping, thick with shame. Tonight, when he fell, what all of you just saw, that wasn't an accident. He finally looked at me, a direct, soul-bearing look of self-hatred. I pulled his chair. I did it on purpose. I wanted him to fall. And then I told him his place was on the floor. The confession hung in the air, ugly and complete. He let the microphone slide back into its stand and stepped forward, off the stage, speaking now with his own raw voice. And why, he asked, his voice cracking. Why would I do all that? Because I'm a coward. Because I've spent my entire life terrified that I would never be half the man my father islanded. And tonight, I met a man who wasn't just my father's equal, but his savior, and I wasn't fit to stand in his shadow. I saw his quiet strength, his dignity, and it made me feel small. So I tried to tear him down to make myself feel big. He was crying now, silent tears tracking down his pale cheeks. He stopped a few feet away from me, no longer addressing the crowd, speaking only to me. Captain Donovan, Frank, he stammered. I am sorry. I am so profoundly and completely sorry. You gave me the gift of a father, and I repaid you with nothing but cruelty. There is no excuse for what I've done. I don't ask for your forgiveness because I haven't earned it. But I am asking, I am begging for a chance to try. He stood there, stripped of all his pretense and pride, a young man confronting the absolute wreckage of his own character in the most public way imaginable. The entire tent was silent, waiting for the hero on the ground to pass judgment on the villain who had just confessed. Caleb stood before me, stripped bare by his own confession, awaiting his sentence. The entire tent, filled with the most influential people in his life, was a silent courtroom, and I was the judge. I could have destroyed him. A single cold word of rejection from me would have cemented his shame forever. For a moment, I let him stand there in the silence, letting the full weight of his actions settle upon him. I saw the tremor in his hands, the genuine self-loathing in his eyes. He wasn't the monster I had come to believe he was. He was just a boy, a deeply insecure boy who had built a fortress of arrogance around himself and just watched it crumble to dust. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself to my feet, my shoulder aching in protest. Mister, Henderson offered a steadying hand, but I shook my head gently. This was something I had to do on my own. I walked the few steps that separated us, each one feeling a mile long. I stopped directly in front of him, the disgraced groom, and looked him square in the eye. It takes a certain kind of courage to run into a burning building, son, I said, my voice quiet but carrying through the stillness of the room. But it takes a different kind, a much rarer kind, to stand in front of the world and admit you were the one who started the fire. Relief, so profound it was almost like pain, washed over his face. I extended my hand, not for a handshake, but placed it on his shoulder. He flinched, as if expecting a blow. Instead, I pulled him forward, into a stiff, awkward embrace. He felt like a boy in my arms, all sharp angles and trembling energy. As I held him, I leaned in and whispered the words that were meant only for him. Welcome to the family, son, I said, my voice rough with emotion. Now you have a legacy to live up to. I felt a shudder go through his body, and he began to sob, not loudly, but with the deep, silent grief of a man who has finally been given a map out of a prison of his own making. That was the moment the spell broke. A tentative, then growing, wave of applause started from the tables nearby. Marcus Thorne came forward, his face a mixture of relief and pride, and put a hand on his son's back. He looked at me over Caleb's shoulder, his eyes shining with a gratitude that needed no words. His wife, Eleanor, rushed to Chloe's side, enveloping her in a tearful hug. The two families, separated by a chasm of class and cruelty, finally, tentatively, began to merge in the center of the room. The crisis had passed. The real work was just beginning. Later that evening, after the initial shock had subsided and a fragile sense of celebration had returned, the band started to play a slow, gentle tune. Chloe walked over to me, her eyes red but clear and shining with a love that felt stronger than ever. "May I have this dance, Dad?" she asked. I took her in my arms, and we swayed gently to the music in the center of the dance floor. She rested her head on my shoulder, just as she had when she was a little girl, and I would dance her to sleep. "He told me everything," she whispered against my tuxedo jacket. "About the threat, about why you came to my office. You trusted me to figure it out on my own. I'm so sorry I didn't see it sooner." "You saw it when you needed to," I said, holding her tight. "I've never been prouder of you than I was tonight, Chloe. You have your mother's strength. You have her heart." We danced in silence for a moment, two survivors of a storm we never saw coming. Over her shoulder, I could see Caleb in a deep, earnest conversation with his father. There were no smiles, no bravado, just the quiet, difficult work of a relationship being rebuilt from the ground up. I knew his road would be long, that earning trust back is harder than any corporate takeover. But for the first time, I believed it was possible. This wedding wasn't the perfect, flawless event Chloe had dreamed of. It was a disaster. It was a train wreck. But as I held my daughter in my arms, surrounded by the quiet hum of a party putting itself back together, I realized it was something more. It was a trial by fire. And from the ashes, we were finally building something real, something strong enough to last.